everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real delight to meet us so beautiful this time of year, and maybe always. I want to start maybe with a little bit of a disclaimer, which is simply that I'm trained as an architect. So in many ways, my work biases towards architectural problems or maybe architectural ways of framing things. But I think that there really is a wide application for this work. And that's perhaps something that we can talk about in the discussion. But also I know this is kind of a mixed crowd, and so if I say something that's too like architecty sounding, feel free to raise your hand and say what are you talking about, or we can also talk about it in the discussion. But also in terms of why I think the work has maybe a kind of wide application, it has to do in part with the motivations for the work in the first place. Primary within that, of course, is the climate crisis, and its urgency is more palpable every day, and so that's really within my work as a kind of baseline. And in that context, I'm also driven by a strong conviction that architecture and the design disciplines can do more. Testing, is that better? No, sounds the same? Okay. I'm driven by the strong conviction that architecture and the design disciplines really should do more, and to think beyond the existing parameters of sustainability to offer an insight into this problem, and perhaps to really think about and find different solutions that can address the issue in a more structural way. But of course, to do that, it's necessary to recontextualize the climate crisis, which in my opinion is more than just a numbers game. Right? It's not simply something that requires just quantifying and sequestering carbon and finding if you spend a little here and you tuck it away over there. I think the climate crisis is really a profound structural question that affects all aspects of society. So it's really about a deep structural transition that involves all sectors of society. So I like this quote by Mackenzie Ward, where she writes, "A problem like climate change is going to need unprecedented collaboration between kinds of knowledge and labor. Such a challenge may well require of us that we produce new kinds of production relations, new technologies, new kinds of affective culture, new ways of organizing the world." Now, notably, architecture is already at the intersection of many of these things, right? It comes out of specific productive relations, it requires technology, it's part of our affective culture, and it is already a way of organizing the world. But if work is asking for these things to be made new, I think that it's framed as a projected question to look forward with. But in many ways, I think we also have to look backwards and understand how we got here. And we have to understand that the building industry can just as easily reify the status quo as much as it can change it, and it actually has an extraordinary power to do so. Because it kind of writes the status quo into space with concrete and steel and brick and glass. So we need new frameworks to look forward into the uncertain future, but I think we also need new frameworks to look to the past as well, and to the present. And in my view, this is particularly important because we need a nuanced understanding of how we got here. Right? We need a means to assess whether we as designers are actually proposing something new, or whether we're simply offering new tools for existing practices. And this, in many ways, is at the core of my work. And in many ways, what I'm trying to think about is whether there can or should be a re-diagnosis of the problem. And this is very specific also to my critique of architecture, architectural discourse, especially in the way that I was educated, where primarily sustainability in architecture was largely focused on technical issues of efficiency and building performance, to really be thought about outside of the design process. And of course, these technical matters of building performance are important in many ways, but to exclusively focus on that, I think, is insufficient. And if we focus on them so exclusively, I think sometimes that has a capacity to obscure some of the most powerful causal forces that are behind the climate crisis, which I would argue have something to do with how space is organized within our built environment. So that's all by way of introduction. So let me just get into it a little bit more so you know really what I mean. And I'm going to start with two critical terms that I've been using in my work. Both of them have the word carbon in them, but I want to quickly offer another disclaimer and say that I don't talk about carbon in a typical way. in the sense that I don't quantify it and I don't measure it. Usually when I say, oh, I work on things related to carbon, everyone asks, you know, if I'm carbon accounting, if I'm good at math. I'm actually not very good at math, I'm sorry to say. What I'm looking for in my work really is a link between carbon and culture, and between carbon and space, and between carbon and how we look at and live in the world. So in that vein, one of the first terms that I want to introduce today is carbon modernity. And this term I like to define as the material and the sociocultural conditions unique to a society characterized by its use of hydrocarbons, in other words, fossil fuels. But of course, to understand why fossil fuels have an influence on culture in the first place, it's important to understand their nature. Now, as I'm sure everyone in this room already knows, fossil fuels are the compressed remnants of organic life from millions of years ago. They're very rich with carbon, which of course is an element, a very important element in biological life. Now, all organic matter has carbon, right? And so this is a conversation also for later of why we're focusing so much on carbon sometimes. People tell me, well, everything has carbon in it. Is everything in carbon form? But there's a point that I want to make here about the nature of fossil fuels specifically, because of their energy density. So the carbon that exists in all organic life, of course, returns to the earth. And in certain geological conditions, these deposits of organic matter are compressed, they're exposed to intense heat and pressure, and they eventually become what we know today as fossil fuels. In other words, coal, gas, natural gas, shale, right? Also known as detrital fossil carbon. And these fuels are extremely dense with carbon. And it just so happens that the molecular bonds between carbon molecules are very tight, and when they've broken, they release a lot of energy. So if you burn something that is dense with carbon, you get a lot of energy. And so one of the most important characteristics of fossil fuels is this density, right? And this density is markedly different from fuel sources that come before the fossil fuel era. And they come from outside of the living biosphere. Right? So this is quite important because this high energy density has shaped the fossil fuel era, and it differentiates it from the energy paradigms that came before. And just to talk a little bit more about the difference between biomass and fossil fuels, just to give an example, coal has 2 to 3 times more energy per unit mass than air-dried wood. So this has an enormous spatial implication. Right, of course, because more energy can be extracted from a smaller amount of material, but also from a specific land area. So there's a different relationship suddenly between a site of energy use and a site of energy consumption. The sites of extraction in some ways become smaller, they can come from more far away. You're not necessarily perceiving the deforestation that would have been maybe immediately next to you in a pre-carbon paradigm where you were extracting energy from a nearby forest. So this is all to say that not only are fossil fuels a spectacular energy source, but they have what Andreas Malm calls a unique spatio-temporal profile. Right? They have a spatial characteristic and they have a temporal characteristic. They come from outside of biological time and from outside of biospheric space. So that means that fossil fuels actually present a new and a unique material condition. And all aspects of society are affected, right? Not just machines and factories, but culture, right? The way we perceive and relate to the world around us, the way that we make, the way that we move, our very ways of life. Now, I like to use excerpts from film to illustrate this, not only because it provides a powerful visual for what I'm describing, but also because I'm interested in how cultural production indexes energy culture. So here you're seeing scenes of existential malaise within an industrial landscape. On the left, that's Michelangelo Antonioni, juxtaposed to the romanticization of colonization via railroad that Sergio Leone wants to contact the West. And this montage is a part of a video piece that I made exploring these ideas, and it's using a diptych that uses juxtaposition on purpose to really look at these scenes against one another. Because in some ways it's easier to see the absurdity of a James Bond film, which is a testosterone-infused petrofantasy, if you see it next to a scene from Office Space, right, which if anything is about the banality of petromobility and carbon subjectivity. right? Or to see it next to Jacques Tati, who's masterful at showing the absurdity of modern space. So my point here is that there is such a thing as carbon culture, and the cultural artifacts produced in our era speak to it inevitably. And architecture, like film, is a cultural artifact. So this leads me to the second framework, or the second term that I want to talk to you, and what I'm really here to talk about in many ways. And this is the idea of carbon form. Now, if carbon modernity is an overarching entanglement, let's say, between human society and carbon energy, and it has many different aspects to it, cultural, economic, political, carbon form is a more focused idea, because it is meant to be really specifically about space and form. So the definition I like to give of it is, when I have to define it in one sentence, is just to say these are the spatial and the formal configurations that are specific to carbon modernity. And the premise is that the adoption of fossil fuels fundamentally changed the built environment, and it injected the processes of design and construction with abundant energy, and it has not been the same since. Right? So there are these spatial configurations that are unique to this era. And so we could say that it started with factories and worker housing, but we can extend it to suburbs and shopping malls and parking lots and transit hubs and infrastructural connectors and warehouses and distribution centers and office towers, apartment buildings and skyscrapers, right? These are the spatial building blocks of the modern world, and they are formal and spatial configurations that architects and builders replicate over and over again. Together, they add up to a unique spatial order, one that is, I would argue, one of the underlying causes of the climate crisis. Not only because they are energy intensive and often dependent on hydrocarbons to function, but also, and maybe more importantly, they hold an energy intensive society in place. They dictate movements and juxtaposition. They shape our way of life. So in other words, at the core of the climate crisis, there is a spatial problem, which means that architecture is at the center of this story, both as built form and as a way of thinking about the world. Now, that last part is key, right? How architects and designers think about space matters. Because once architects realized the potential of carbon energy to reorganize society, they explicitly began to propose new spatial organizations that changed the history of the city forever. So I'm going to tell you a little story to illustrate this point. And just starting with early carbon form, when the Industrial Revolution just started up, what we were seeing in terms of carbon form was that things were somewhat haphazard. In many ways, the city was pretty chaotic, right? What was happening is that the city was growing and changing as capitalists and factory owners were pushing the new economic regime of industrialism with all the power that was unleashed by fossil fuels. Now, of course, architects can't help but notice this. And through that process, I would argue that carbon form became an explicit architectural project. In his book, The New City, the architect Ludwig Hilbersheimer includes these two photos. And Hilbersheimer is a modernist architect that was thinking a lot about the rise of industry and what the fate of the city should be. So The New City is a sort of treatise of a kind. And so he has these two photos, and on the left there's a skyline of New York. And it's just a picture of the skyline of New York, but he captions it disorder and chaos, which I love. And he pairs this with an image of a traffic jam to show that industrial society is blossoming within a pre-carbon spatial structure. And in his view, it is not working. So against this, he proposes a project of reorganization, right? So here are two proposals. Here's his solution for Manhattan, which is, I think, for someone who lived in New York for 8 years, it's very funny. And then there's also a proposal for the eastern United States. But essentially what you see in both of these is that all settlement has been reorganized into a linear system where goods and people can flow without friction. Now, at this point, it might be helpful to give a little bit of historical context in terms of the narratives that architects tell themselves about architectural history. And often in architecture in school, you learn that modernism was about a wholesale rejection of the past. And that, everything was about a kind of brand new language, a brand new world. But what's interesting to me in doing this research and in revisiting a lot of these 20th century treatises on architecture in order to understand the origins of carbon form, I found out from Hilbersheimer to Le Corbusier especially, that in a lot of these protagonists of the modern era, you can see a lot of interest in ancient cities, actually. And what I noticed here is that the problem was not the past per se, but rather it was an obsession with solving the problems of the 19th century city, which had been transformed by industry and mechanizing living. Right? So what you had was a city that often was medieval in structure, was often not gridded. These guys were working in Europe, so they had these non-gridded cities that had inherited ancient spatial structures, pre-carbon spatial structures. And within that, there was a conflict with the spatial demands of industry. So in their view, the city essentially had to transform. But this time it was going to be to accommodate a process that had already been underway for about 100 years, right? Industry was already in place. So this is a quote by Le Corbusier, who gives me a lot of great carbon form material. And he says, "In the last 100 years, a sudden, chaotic, and sweeping invasion, unforeseen and overwhelming, has descended upon the great city. The resultant chaos has brought it about that the great city, which should be a phenomenon of power and energy, is today a menacing disaster. Since, and I think this is the most important part, since it is no longer governed by the principles of geometry. So what is lacking is geometry, order, intention, form, right? The problem was not necessarily history. The problem was that the cities of the 19th century had a spatial structure that could not accommodate the power and the speed of carbon energy." Now, there's another passage from the same book by Le Corbusier, The City of Tomorrow, that I think is really remarkable, and I'm not going to read it all because it's quite long. But what's happening here is that Le Corbusier is narrating a fall afternoon, where he's walking down the Champs-Élysées in Paris. And the traffic has just started up again after it was summer. He's contemplating the traffic. And he's thinking about how the streets used to be when he was young, a place for singing. Right? And he says the road belonged to us back then. Now they're full of motors in all directions, going at all speeds. And you think he's about to get really nostalgic, but actually he doesn't, right? He says, "I was overwhelmed and enthusiastic. Rapture filled me," he writes. "Not the rapture of the shining coach under the gleaming lights, but the rapture of power." He goes on, and the rhetoric actually gets a little bit more crazy. There's a city that's crumbling, there's a torrent that can't keep to its bed, right? He's really kind of having a moment here as he's followed by a traffic jam. But the point here is that in the congestion, he sees potential. What he sees is power, right? And so Corb walks away from this experience, ready to destroy the old city and to give form to something new. Because he saw in that moment, immersed in the speed and congestion of early carbon form, that the true potential of carbon form had not been realized. So harnessing that power would, from then on, become his project. And that's how you get an architect that's willing to take the existing form of the city and tear it open in order to give it a new form. So what can we conclude from this little anecdote? One, I would say that there's nothing inevitable about carbon form as we know it today. Because the history of carbon form is a story about design. It's a story about architecture. And by architecture, I don't mean just buildings. What I also mean is the way that people make buildings have a specific way of thinking about space, right? And so fossil fuels, I would say, not only sort of automatically change the organization of space through their own processes, it wasn't a passive process. Because what happened is that that energy source in and of itself changed how designers think about space. And once designers had that shift in the way that they think, they started designing differently. So design is a huge part of the story, right? Fossil fuels have changed architectural thought, right? Whether we're talking about European modernism or Soviet revolutionary architecture or late modern megastructures or Japanese metabolism or even corporate modernism, these were architectural projects that lent the power of architecture, of form, of organization, of design to the overturning of a previous world order and to the building of a new world. Now, because of this, I would argue that it's possible to say that architectural thought in and of itself is a force acting on history just as much as carbon energy itself. And I would also argue that when it comes to climate change, understanding that evolution of architectural thought, in other words, the way we think about space, is just as important as understanding how much CO2 there is in the atmosphere today, or how much carbon moves through a particular building. Because it's not only the construction of architecture and the operation of buildings that contributes to the climate crisis, it's also that arrangement of space itself, both at the urban and the architectural scale. Now, if I'm focusing on modernism, it is not because carbon form is only a modernist phenomenon, but because I want to make the point that at a certain moment in time, carbon form was this explicit and active architectural project, right? You had these large groups of architects internationally that were trying to give industrial society a new form. Of course, eventually this kind of fervor for industry subsided, but it did so after irreversibly strengthening carbon. And we inherited these spatial organizations, and they continue to hold a fossil fuel society in place. So while architectural modernism did die, the necessary death, in my view, has not come because carbon modernity has not died. And as Walter Benjamin said of capitalism, it will not die a natural death. But die it must, and a crucial step in that process, I think, is to properly define carbon form so that we can bring it to the obsolescence that it deserves. So this is what I like to call the work of confronting carbon form. And I think it's a necessary first step to finding an alternative. Or even just to find a different way of working. Because if we don't first recognize carbon form for what it is, we might be inevitably and unconsciously replicating it. So for the past, I think 6 years now, I've been dedicating myself to building up a definition of carbon form. And I've used several mediums to do this. Writing is one of the primary ones. I've also been coordinating talks and events, and I've been very lucky to have been in conversation with others since I first started working on this. But I also produce visual works, and in 2023 these became an exhibition titled Confronting Carbon Form. This was the result of a collaboration with two friends and colleagues, Sam Cho and Elisa Iturbe. And the goal of this work was to give a working definition of carbon form. And we used many different media because carbon form is complicated, and there are many examples. But we used drawing, we used painting, we used physical model, mixed media pieces, projection, and all of these together have helped me to develop several techniques for identifying carbon form, or what I also like to call modes of reading. So I'd like to maybe just share a few of those with you now. As I go through them, I'll pull a few pieces from the show that I just mentioned, since in many ways making those pieces kind of helped me develop these modes of reading. But I'm not going to talk about the exhibition directly, but I'll pull some pieces from it as needed. But the first way of reading carbon form, I think, is by doing so typologically. And perhaps some of you who are not trained in architecture are maybe not so familiar with that way of using the word type. But type or typology is simply a way that architects tend to classify buildings. So often it comes to commonalities in function, right? So we'll say, the school type or a factory type or a hospital type. But it can also be a spatial or a formal property that's independent of function. So we might say, oh, this building is a courtyard type or a high-rise tower, right? They're kind of categories, let's say. But the start of the industrial era put a lot of pressure on the built environment because many industrial processes were being invented for the first time, and existing buildings couldn't house those activities quite yet. So what you saw was the emergence of new building types. And in 1962, Rainer Banham, the architecture theorist, wrote a book titled Guide to Modern Architecture. And he opens by noting that the emergence of the new architecture of the previous decades was due to the fact that new functions had arisen and old ones had changed. And he said that the reader could judge for themselves whether or not this was true, simply by asking how many new functions had appeared since the death of Julius Caesar and the invention of the steam engine. And he himself tries to think of as many as he can. Turns out not that many. All he could think of was the monastery and the church. Those were the only two new functions that had emerged. And so he says, the list was so short, so few functions had appeared, that in the Renaissance, architecture was able to resume the classical dress of Roman times with only a little letting out of seams and moving of buttons. Now with industry, of course, this changes, and he says that with the appearance of even primitive factories, these old architectural garments begin to get stretched, and he says that architects were faced with functional problems for which the past was no guide. So the new functions, he writes, compelled the architects of the Sea Age to build in shapes and sizes that the ancients could not have recognized. For the first time in 2,000, perhaps 4,000 years, the daily life of Western man and Western woman, even more so, was being revolutionized. So the point here is that modernity demanded typological perfection, right? So we can read this in architecture, right? And now I've already listed a few of these typologies, but I think it's also important to note their variety. And also to note that this typological evolution has continued in the 21st century, right? Not just by continuing the evolution of 20th century types, now we have bigger transportation hubs, but we've also had the emergence of new types even since then, right? Distribution centers, pencil towers, data centers. Now obviously, these types are all very different from each other, spatially, culturally, etc. But what I would argue is that they are the spatial building blocks of carbon modernity. And together they create this specific spatial paradigm or spatial order. And each type has a different function within that. In other words, they might be different from each other typologically, but spatialize a whole new set of productive forces. And the design problem was the choreography of industrial life. So in that sense, I would argue that this drawing, which is an urban design by Le Corbusier, is nothing other than a crystallized diagram of the class dynamics of industry. Now within the spatial order, different building types work together, and they add up to a coherent spatial system that operates at both the architectural and the urban scale. So I think that this question of type is essential, but so then is the question of urban form, right? Which I would also argue operates, if not typologically, since that's a word we usually use for the building scale, at least archetypically. And actually at the urban scale, unlike at the building scale, I think you can really start to narrow in on a handful of archetypes that constitute carbon form at the urban scale, right? The buildings, I feel like there's just so much variety between functions and different kinds of buildings, but I think we do get replicable types and patterns that are rooted in carbon energy in some way, and that you find in contemporary built form all over the world. Now, I tend to work with 5 archetypes. To think about them, that is not meant to be exhaustive. I'm sure there are many more, but in my work, these are ones that I have found over and over again that I am thinking about. So these archetypes are the infinite grid, the linear city, towers in the park, Manhattanism, and suburban sprawl. I'm not going to talk about each of them individually, but maybe just stay at the sort of the level of the archetype. But as you might perhaps notice, I'm associating each one here with a drawing by a specific architect or planner. I listed their names below the drawing. But the reason for doing this, and the reason to point out this question of authorship or to try to locate an author, is to really argue that many of the urban organizations that we have today are taken for granted, but in many cases we can trace them back to specific moments in time where individual designers were. the importance of design, right? Each of the authors of the designs that we model generated new ideas for spatial organization. Whether they built that specific design or not almost doesn't matter so much, because in the end, each became an archetype and model, and all of them were replicated all over the world in some way. So there's, in some way, like a sense of excess and absurdity that we were interested in when making these models, and I think that that gets at a very specific point about how to understand the formal qualities of carbon form. Because one thing we see in them, whether they are dense or sparse, is this disposition towards multiplication and growth. And that's part of the idea behind the mirrors, of course. And it also tells us something about how carbon form can be read, right? Because even though I do think it's an idea that's about the shape of the thing or the form of the thing, it's not really about the specific geometry of the instance, right? It's more about how the form behaves or how it choreographs specific relationships. So that's carbon form as type. The next thing I want to talk about is carbon form as index. And in this mode of reading, I'm looking for ways in which form registers the specific qualities of carbon energy. And here I like to talk about the Elisa Iturbe. I'm telling you that Elisa gave me a lot of material, so sorry if you guys don't want to hear about Elisa anymore. But he's a key character in the story. The Elisa Iturbe, I think, is an important instance of carbon form as index, but to show it, I think it's easier to understand why by comparison. So this is the Palazzo Barberini in Rome. It's decidedly not a carbon form. It was built between 1556 and 1629. This is a plan and a section of it. And what I think is quite interesting about this building is that on its central axis, there's this ramp for horses and carriages that runs right through the center of this palazzo, like right underneath. But what that means is that the dimensions and the proportion and the scale of this building are all calibrated to the movement of human and animal bodies through space according to the dominant energy paradigm of that time. In contrast, here is the ground floor plan of the Elisa Iturbe, where the curve of this figure explicitly registers the turning radius of the object, right? So in other words, the radius of the figure registers the new ways in which humans begin to move through space under a carbon paradigm. And so what this means is that carbon form, I think, is defined by a formal configuration that is really indexing the specificities of life under carbon energy. In other words, the building is kind of registering in space the new ways in which energy is being harnessed. So together, these two buildings show that architectural form, which is an area in architectural studies that is long thought to be separate from energetic concerns or environmental concerns, at least in my own education. This is changing now. But this category of form, I think, is not disassociated from energy, actually. Form can register specific characteristics of energy through slope, width, radius, plan, section, right? In other words, through architecture itself. And so in this reading, I think we can see that carbon form can be indexable. But there's another thing that I want to say here, which is that I don't like to think of architecture as only responsive to energetic conditions. Right? I think that architecture is also generative of ways of life in general, but specifically of energy-intensive ways of life. So I think we also need another way of reading carbon form that doesn't look at it as only passive, let's say, sort of receiving the influences of an energy paradigm. And so this mode of reading I like to call carbon form as a script. The example I like to use here is a suburb. Not only because, of course, suburbs have a specific vocabulary of spatial planning and they have a legible anatomy, right? You have highways that lead to secondary roads, that lead to minor roads and then cul-de-sacs. There's a very specific organization there spatially, but it also organizes how people live, right? It's a spatial system that distributes people and goods in space. And the other thing that we need to consider here with the suburb is that many of us are born into these spatial structures with few opportunities to change them. Right? In fact, they predetermine so much of how we live. So in this kind of landscape, one does not have many choices for alternative modes of life. And so this is why I'm resistant to the idea that form follows energy. Sometimes people think that that's my framework, but actually, when you frame it that way, it makes it seem like energy is the primary causal force, and that architecture or space is only receiving the impact of those forces. But part of my point here is that once form emerges, it exerts its own forces on the environment, on people. So fossil fuels are not the only forces that are acting on us. We have to recognize that the built form acts on both the environment and on the social relations that play out. So in this reading, I don't see carbon form so much as indexical, although of course in many ways it is indexing abundant energy because this whole thing requires a lot of energy. But I like to think about it also as scripting. So in thinking about this particular topic, my collaborators did a spatial study of 3 different settlement patterns in 3 different densities. But the mid-density site, incidentally, is Bonita, California, just 30 minutes from here. I think this is a pretty interesting suburb for different reasons. But I'll share a little bit of the study of Bonita just to kind of continue this theme of scripting and to show you what we found. Now this drawing shows the building footprints, and this is really Bonita and Chile, and National City, actually. But the focus really of the study was Bonita. These are the primary arteries, and the primary means of moving through the landscape, essentially. And then here is the zoning, which, as you can see, is primarily residential. There's a little bit of more mixed use in Chula Vista, and there are a few kind of corridors of commercial. But just to go back to the arteries for a second, just to think more about this idea of scripting, because I'm interested in how roads are really circumscribing these zones that have really nothing other than residential, right? And so the space between these primary roads is primarily constituted by cul-de-sacs. So unless you live there, you don't go through them. So I like to think about them as these kind of large zones of impassable space, right? So you have to circulate around them and not through them. So if you track the mobility of a suburban resident living in this landscape, you can see that the movement is highly constrained and very predetermined, right? You get this pattern of out and back, where the home is this fixed point, and then you have a steady path to work and back. That's kind of the daily one, and then you have this array of secondary paths that are going to different points of consumption to retrieve what is needed in a home, let's say. So from the perspective of a suburban subject, of a suburban resident, this path it almost becomes a kind of closed loop, right? And daily life takes this form with a little interaction with productive landscapes beyond. But of course, in order for human life to even occur here, a lot of things have to happen beyond this exclusively residential zone. And I think that one of the reasons I like Bonita, and one of the reasons I think is particular in this regard, is that just off the map, you have highly productive zones, very nearby, right? To the east, you have Imperial Valley with a heavy agricultural production. To the south, you have Maquilas. And to the northwest, you have Port. But what's interesting is that from the perspective of this suburban subject, these productive zones, even when they are close, are these kinds of unspecified elsewheres. There's like almost no interaction between the suburban resident and all these sites of consumption, right? So the specifics of that elsewhere matter little to the consumer. And I think we can see a spatial pattern here, right? Because there's a specific logic to this, which I might further abstract to just make the point, which is that the suburban resident is essentially moving between home, work, and store, right? That's kind of their path. Somewhere far away, there are these productive systems constantly at work to sustain that life. And all of the commodities they're producing are fed into the system in these networks. One might even say that the only interface between them, between these different landscapes, is the store, right? The site of consumption. So now retaining this abstraction but grounding it back in Bonita, you might draw it something like this, right? Where the spatial footprint of the suburban subject that I mentioned earlier, that spatial footprint becomes blue. And there are some productive sites nearby, right? The Port and the Maquilas. But what this drawing is really meant to show is that still from a spatial standpoint, these sites end up being spatially exclusive from each other. right? And whatever productive sites exist nearby in themselves are fed by other productive sites elsewhere that this person will likely never know. So I'm interested in how the contemporary built environment is characterized by the extreme exclusion of what we consider to be dwelling from other aspects of life, namely production. And this happens whether a settlement pattern is dense or sparse. So as I said, this was part of a study of 3 different settlement patterns. And the different densities, it was Miami, it was Bonita, and a small town in Iowa. And all of these sites tend to keep productive landscapes at bay and to preserve that kind of isolation of domestic space from the sites of production and from the ecosystems that support them. And even within rural Iowa, you could see this. You might think that you wouldn't because Iowa is very agricultural. But as long as the agriculture is industrial, most of that production is for export, and the person working on the farm is not necessarily going to consume what they produce. They're probably still going to go to the grocery store. So this became a large set of drawings. I'm going to skip them for now, just to give you a sense here. But just to say one final thing, because maybe the suburban analysis seems maybe somewhat unremarkable, maybe, I don't know, you can tell me in the comments, because so many places operate like this. So in many ways, you have to kind of look at it against something that is not carbon formed. And so this has been some of my research as well, looking at pre-modern settlement patterns to just have a sense of contrast. I won't go too deeply into it, but this is an archaeologist named Louis Bigford who studies non-sedentary settlement patterns in foraging societies, and I think his work is extremely interesting and fascinating. He does these beautiful drawings of foraging settlement patterns. And what I think is super important and interesting about the difference in the mobility patterns between a suburban resident and a foraging society is that unlike in a consumer landscape, people are moving through an environment that is productive for them, right? As they move to find food, or as they move through space, they're finding food, preparing and eating it. They bring their families with them, their activities. So all of this is sort of moving through the landscape and happening in reciprocity with and in reaction to the specificities of the ecosystem. It produces a lot of different kinds of sites, which I think is very different. But so again, just to use abstraction to sort of reduce things into what might be a little bit more legible, I think there are a couple points here to make. One is that in the carbon era, we see settlement patterns that are largely indifferent to the specificities of the landscape, right? So carbon energy, because of its density, because of its abundance, we no longer think about these kinds of things in our daily lives, but they produce these highly resource-intensive landscapes. It's just that we sort of just receive all of the products of them without having to confront the production of that energy of those commodities. But also, if the suburban resident moves predictably sort of between home, work, store, the foraging societies could not be more different, right? Not only might you have multiple homes, right? They move seasonally or maybe from week to week, depends on what kind of ecosystem you're looking at. But ultimately, I would propose that these are fundamentally different spatial orders. And I think it would be perhaps be safe to say that carbon form is a spatial order that's characterized by separation, right? The separation between production and consumption. And these other kinds of settlement patterns are characterized by their integration. And the other thing I would say is that I think that they really are different spatialities. One of them is a vector-based spatiality, and the other one is more a field-based spatiality. And what I mean by that is that in one, movement is constrained, right, to a prescribed vector or path. And that path offers speed, but one has to accept that the path is predetermined. We can never really move in the crossway. And I think that these are fundamentally different ways of moving through space, and they have a very important concept. Often we move through an environment without going into it, right? So these videos were both taken in the same landscape. But what I hope to show is that walking in the mountains is fundamentally different from driving through them. Right? And it may seem like a simple point, but I think it's important to recognize that mechanized mobility always retains something of a separateness from the surrounding environment. And it also tells us something very important about carbon form, which is a paradigm that in many ways is defined by mobility and motion. Right? The philosopher Thomas Nail, who wrote book Being in Motion, says we live in an age of movement. More than at any other time in history, people and things move longer distances, more frequently and faster than ever before. All that was solid melted into air long ago and is now in full circulation around the world, like dandelion seeds adrift in the turbulent winds. Now, I would say certainly we're moving farther and faster, but in my view, it's much less like a dandelion adrift in the wind, and it's more like you're in a 2-ton metal box barreling down the infinite linear space of the highway. And so our mobility is more restricted than we like to think, to the point where I think many people, in this country at least, can't even choose to not have a car. So our lives are scripted by carbon form, and we have to move through space in that way. And from that perspective, I would argue that the spatial organization of the built environment matters enormously for any transition that seeks to address the climate crisis. So I'll just leave you with that, and I'm very happy to have discussion, and I hope that have some questions.
Good afternoon. Has any estimates been made for transitioning from carbon to an electric world in terms of cost and time? Your thoughts, thank you.
Sorry, can you say the last part again? To transition to electric through time? I didn't hear the last.
Oh, she's asking, can you clarify what do you mean by the transition to electric?
In other words, at least from what I've been reading, we're going to have to transition from a carbon-powered world to an electrical-powered world because of climate change. Well, to do that means that it's going to cost, there's got to be cost involved to do that, and how long will it take to do that?
I don't have the answer to that question. I do not know. I think that's an extremely complex question that involves so many sectors. It depends on policy, it depends on technological innovation, it depends on so many things. So I would feel completely unable to give you a number or an estimate. But what I would say is that from my perspective, I think we can't think of transition only as a process of electrification because, and this is in many ways my reason for wanting to study these spatial structures, because you can take a suburb and electrify it, but the spatial structure has fundamentally been left in place. And what that means is that you still have a highly energy intensive built environment. And so my interest is actually intervening on the spatial environment spatially so that there can be a different relationship to energy in the first place.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you can go back a few slides. You had those diagrams at Bonita of like suburbs versus the production zones that were outside of it. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the lived experience of people who travel outside of that on a regular basis to work in the production zones.
Yeah. So this study was not meant to be exhaustive of like all suburban subjects. It was really, in many ways actually, it was meant to be more of kind of like a test of whether we could find similar patterns across sites of different densities. But so I do think that there is, like if this were to be an actual like intensive study of Bonita itself, it would have to be quite different. So yeah, that's sort of part of the just the limitation of the framework.
I guess what I mean is the fact that that is a limitation of the framework, I think says something to those people who work outside in the production zones. Should I read that?
Oh yeah, no, I heard it.
Okay. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, is there also a script that is
able for so many things at one time. But yes, I feel like this, and also for me, like this work is like completely, it's like ongoing and in many ways like unfinished. So point well taken, but also I think there's just more work to be done, right? And I see this as unfinished, right? So continuing to look at that stuff. But yeah, I think that this is a super interesting point about like, yeah, what it means to be in those particular sites of production. This was meant to be more of a critique of consumer society specifically.
Okay.
So I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah, thank you.
yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so I think from my understanding is like carbon form is not necessarily carbon. Like it's like more of a focus on production and efficiency and things like that. So I'm wondering like if you are focusing on like a different spatial relationship between things, how would you compensate the potential loss for the production forces, or is that gonna be a
The loss of production forces, what do you mean by that?
like if you don't have like a designated, like if there is not a worker that spend like large amount of hours in the factory or something like that, and he lives like a more of a balance.
Or like quiet quitting? Like if workers are quiet quitting?
I think it's more of like the change of modes for living, like how that
Yeah,
affects.
well, I mean, that's the question, right? And I think I also don't have the answer to that either. I mean, we have to invent those new modes of living. Like, I in this work am actually not at this time making a specific recommendation. So like, I'm also not saying like, okay, now all industrial workers have to quit. And we saw during the pandemic, right, when there were huge impacts on people's ability to work, it had enormous economic consequences, right? And so we have a moral obligation to all the people that are living on this planet to sustain their lives and to respect everybody who currently has a life. So I'm not suggesting that suddenly we just like turn the switch off. What I'm suggesting is that we have to understand these processes and understand them as close as we can to their roots so that we can make alternative proposals for how to live. And I think that requires very careful study, because for me, one of the lessons of carbon form, if we kind of look at the 20th century and what architects were doing, is that they just got on the industrial bandwagon and were like, awesome, I'm gonna make you some nice buildings and it's all gonna work great. And that's part of the problem, right? It's sort of like when designers don't necessarily like try to critique the system that they are within, they end up reproducing it. So I think my primary point is that if we are designers, we have to be very critical of the system that we're operating in order to try to position ourselves. I'm not suggesting go to the factory and turn off the switch. I'm suggesting that we start to imagine alternative ways of life that will place different demands on production, or that we might sort of loosen our own like very high dependencies on very energy intensive systems by maybe stitching other kinds of productive processes back into the city, or like this has to do with food production, it has to do with like all sorts of things, like different ways of making and different ways of living that we have to begin to propose. Otherwise, yeah, if we just try to say none of this works and we just have to stop, there's actually no off ramp there.
Can I have a follow-up?
Oh, sorry.
Okay,
Yeah, I'm gonna take a moment to that point you made about reorganizing how maybe food production is located in relation to cities. So next week, Ellie Igo is the founder of Food Shed, which is a cooperative food systems distributor, and they work with farms that are local, like all around San Diego. So actually, like there's a really good connection between what you were saying and who we're going to hear from next week. All right, so I'll turn to you, have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you for the
question.
yeah, thank you for the presentation. I was like really interested in this point you made about kind of like, you know, it's really about the form like that carbon takes and trying to figure out what those forms are, or like ways of kind of, I guess, like formalizing like what those forms are. I was wondering if you ever considered like a transnational lens and thinking about Because I know like the global north, I think we consume 5 times more energy than the global south. And a lot of the production is like offshore. And so I was wondering like what carbon form would look like if you were to kind of think about like logistics and global trade and all of this.
Yeah, well, so kind of as I alluded to, I feel like the study of carbon form is basically infinite, and I feel like there are so many different ways into it, and I constantly feel like there are things that I haven't looked at enough. I think in the sense, like, you know, this study in particular is US focused, but like in terms of looking at the urban archetypes, we were looking at all the examples are from all over the world, so like that one was not US focused. And then a lot of the precedents that I've looked at are all over the world. What I'm trying to do is to kind of like, sometimes I describe it a little bit as like panning for gold. I like try to look at as many things as possible, and then I like sift them and see what commonalities emerge. So if it seems a little bit homogenous, it's in part because I'm trying to find those commonalities basically in order to create a definition. But I feel like now that that has happened, like that is the point that the work is kind of at, and trying to decide, okay, but like where are the entry points into looking at things deeper? But what I would also say is that I feel like carbon form is not just my project. I sort of see it as like I'm like trying to kind of posit it as a question that like, can you please all think about this because I can't do it by myself. And I think that's a completely like essential line of thinking. And I mean, sometimes that's something that we talk about in my classes. So I teach on this subject, and so I'll have students pick examples of things that they believe are carbon form, and then they have to argue why it's carbon form, and they kind of have to look at its dynamics, and I make them draw them. And so that's definitely come up in those kind of discussions. So like I was just telling you earlier that, you know, I definitely always have students who look at like distribution centers, or you know, I had a group of students one year do IKEA, and they made this beautiful diagram of basically their kind of their global logistics. I don't know if you know the work of Jesse Le Cavalier, but he's a friend of mine, and we have a lot of conversation about logistics and how all of it. I mean, I just think that all of these logistical spaces are a huge part of understanding carbon form. But you know, over the years and over in the different projects that I've done on trying to study aspects of carbon form, they're just kind of different areas of focus that emerge in one moment or another. And that's certainly one that I sort of flagged that I want to go into more deeply.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I have so many questions, but I think the one I'm picking to ask in this group space is, so like one of the things that your talk has me thinking about is like to what extent can designers actually, you know, like we can try to imagine alternative forms, but then a lot of whether those forms become available and politically viable to do depend on what is the cost of fuel, like what kinds of disincentives are in place, like where is land cheap enough that you can actually build, or if you have to privately acquire the land. And then I'm also thinking about like the yellow bus protests in France. I don't know if that was like 8-9 years ago, where like the French government, Macron tried to put a gas tax to reduce reliance on cars, and then a lot of working class people who had been forced into this, who had either been forced into or ended up living in the suburbs because that's where housing is more affordable, but they like depend on their cars for work. So they really kind of went into rebellion. And so like there's like something about like what are the actual political economies that like would make a transition possible, but then what do we, and this is like not, you don't have to solve this problem, obviously, but you've thought about it a lot more than the rest of this industry. Like, and then there's like these cultural like petro attachments that we have of like, yeah, my car, my kids, like watching, I don't have, you know, kids in the iPad, doing the iPad in the back. How do we think about like political transition? Like, do we go to the places where gas is expensive and like try to implement things there to show that there's like an example, or the 15-minute city is very controversial, I hear. Planning.
I mean, honestly, what I think we need is just a very wide array of strategies. And I think that they have to be heterogeneous, they have to be site specific. And I think that the thing that should unite them is a sense of what the problem is. And then there have to be just a bunch of different strategies. But like one thing I would say about design is that design has the capacity to affect culture. And that's one of the lessons that I've learned from carbon form is the impact that design had in the 20th century to like basically portray modern life, right? And to like draw it for people and like start building it and give examples and then like disseminate images and drawings and materials and film and like, you know, there was a moment where people had to be convinced that this new way of life was desirable. And I think design played an important part in that. And so I think that there are ways in which we have to ask ourselves what the allegiances of design are, right? And so I think that I see carbon form, when carbon form was really like a conscious project in the 20th century, it was trying to give form to industrial society. I think the question is, what else do we need to give form to now? But what that means is that also like designers have to ask themselves, well, what it's not like design is going to think of the social system to come, but I think that design has to ask, okay, what are the things that are emerging and how can the power of design be lent to those projects? So, you know, I think it can happen in so many different ways, and I feel like in my work, I'll have my own ways of doing it, but as I said, like, I don't want to be the only person working on this. You know, one project that my design collaborator and I worked on was working with a community of interest to like help them envision how an alternative ownership model would help them create more self-sufficiency within their community, and like whether they could combine lots and sort of create little like worker cooperatives that would tend to the gardens and make food locally, you know, so like we were kind of helping them envision that, and we were drawing it for them and helping them understand code and regulations. So like that was one instance where like we as designers were trying to like help them visualize what that alternative political structure could do spatially. But that has to be a situation also where a designer is working in a team, right? Where I think it's not just the designer like imagining new shapes, it's like really thinking about how the built environment is produced and what our role is within that. So, but it's a complicated question, and there's so many ways. Thank you.
Hi. So a lot of our cities today are two-dimensional and flat, I've noticed, which is why we need like highways and zoning laws. Because I wanted to ask, do you see a future where we move to three-dimensional layered cities to make better use of space and not have to rely on so much transportation?
Do you just mean that cities are more vertical?
Correct.
I think there's a role for that, but I would say that for me, one of the most important things is actually the stitching together of production and consumption. Because you have highly vertical cities, but that if they're monofunctional, they're still relying on the distant landscape that's producing everything in that space. So for me, the density is not the only solution. Density is a strategy that requires paying attention to where production happens.
What that made me think of also is like, so in my neighborhood, I think there's a battle over this site and how it's gonna get redeveloped, and part of it is about having teachers be able to live near, you know, the community where they're actually doing their teaching. So like that's not something that, but you saying that made that snap into place. It's like that's a design and spatiality question, like just fighting for affordable housing for teachers.
Yes. And the conventional development models tend to not take that into account. They are all run on a profit motive and are not trying to design for that kind of thing. So I think that's a very important thing for designers to tackle and to start intervening, because we're like often in the right rooms where we can contest that kind of thing. Not that we have the ability to rewrite all the code on our own, but like designers are working at the intersection of all these things.
Oh yes, okay.
Hi. I was really compelled by the framing of carbon form as separation-based spatial order, as in a separation between consumption and production, in which restrictions on mobility sort of do the ordering. And one of the things I'm compelled by is sort of if you like take away some of the specificity of separation between consumption and production, and just talk about like spatial orders in which, like separation-based spatial orders in which mobility restrictions are what is doing the ordering or largely doing the ordering. You could have kind of a translatable theoretical framework for different, like non-carbon sort of non-carbon specific, even if entangled with carbon, questions of design, and I was wondering if you've thought about that, of that sort of translatability, and the resonances there with, once you sort of like broaden that scope of like, what does it mean to have a separation-based social order, spatial order, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think it goes back to one of the questions that happened earlier, where like, is the point really carbon, right? And in some ways, like I chose the word carbon very early on in this project, and like there are days when I think, okay, the word carbon kind of needs to follow. The point of picking carbon was simply to make the link to fossil fuel, which is to make the link to carbon, right? But in many ways, the use of fossil fuel is so entangled with all of these other things that they can't really be separated. And like someone asked me the other day, like, aren't you really talking about a capital form or like, something else? And yeah, and it's like, kind of. And like in my class, like week 1 is about capitalism, and it's like we're trying to understand these processes because that's kind of it's the context into which fossil fuels are inserted. Right, and so like we have to understand what that is. So yeah, in some ways, and as the more I continue to study this, the more these other frameworks come up, like separation versus integration. And like in many ways, and like to the point about density too, like I think integration is the project in many ways. But I still see it as a way to address carbon form, and ultimately, like in trying to do these histories. I feel like if you're trying to really write a history of carbon form, it has to start at the beginning of human settlement. Because there's a moment in time where like surplus extraction is developed and becomes a particular thing. And then from that point in time, it's all one continuous thing. Fossil fuels are different in terms of their energy density, but the systems that were in place socially and economically started with colonialism and capitalism, and then fossil fuels was a tool that kind of magnified them. So like one of the questions I often have to ask myself is like, well, what is different in the fossil fuel era, if anything? But what I have kind of found is that space is the thing that's different because of the affordance of the fossil fuels, because that energy abundance lets everything become like bigger and further apart. And so there's an influence on space that I think is the kind of thing, and that's why I think carbon form is still kind of believe in it for that reason, but it's kind of tangled up with all these questions. So like I think as soon as we start asking what alternatives are there, in my view, alternatives don't rest in renewable energy. Like we've already seen that renewable energy is just feeding into the grid, right? And it hasn't sort of catalyzed or triggered a real alternative. The alternatives have to come from understanding the deep roots of the social system that fossil fuels are inserted inside of. So I don't know, does that answer your question, sort of?
Yeah, I also wasn't saying like, oh, what if it wasn't carbon form? But was also saying like, can carbon form theorize other things? Right?
Yes. Well, what do you think?
I mean, I think yes. That framework of separation and mobility restrictions to the rest of my research. So,
Oh, cool.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I would hope so, right? And I mean, I feel like in many ways, like I'm trying to conceive of carbon form as a framework. That, as I said, like it's not just my own project, but it can be applied to different things. And I do think that what I have found, at least for myself, is that it can continually shows things to me, right? As soon as I kind of apply this lens, I can see. So yeah, I mean, I would hope.
This is our last
Too
question.
much. Oh.
That's okay. No.
I was trying to wind this into like a coherent question, but I'll try here. I was trying to maybe think about pressing on that some of the distinctions that you were drawing between like so-called pre-modern, infrastructural and transportation modes and network forms, and then the so-called modern forms that were associated with the carbon form.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and just anecdotally, like some people in like infrastructure studies and indigenous studies will talk about how like things like the transcontinental railroad in the U.S.
Yeah.
It claims the invention of crossing the continental U.S. But it tracks and maps onto indigenous trade routes, which were already well established and known and utilized, right, very broadly. So, is there also a way in which like the carbon form is always just a distortion of other forms
Yes,
that, and
yes.
it, kind of through this sort of colonization, metabolization sort of process.
Yeah, and actually, I, in a different version of the spectrum, I would spend a lot more time on the question of mobility. And actually in my class, I do like a whole week on mobility and a whole set of readings on this. But yes, I mean, I think this is why I'm interested in making the point that carbon mobility is actually defined by certain contradictions. And that's why I like that quote by Thomas Nail. He's like, now we live in an age of movement. I'm actually quite critical of that because if you look at pre-sedentary societies, people were moving around a lot. And in many ways, we're more mobile. There are so many specific restrictions that come from carbon mobility. So in many ways, my view is that carbon mobility is not only defined by mobility, it's actually defined more by speed, and that speed is achieved through constraint of how and where you move. And so, there's like a whole other, we can talk about it for an hour, I can give you a whole other set of references for that. But I think that's right, and I think that we shouldn't actually think that carbon mobility is the first mobility paradigm. It's just a specific one, and it comes with its own constraints, right? And so I think that it actually has certain ironies, right? And the reason I'm interested in non-sedentary societies is because that's an energy paradigm where you would move out into the environment to retrieve what you needed. And what happens from agriculture onward, so also speaking of like continuities with carbon era and pre-carbon eras and where you find continuities, as soon as you start to have an agrarian paradigm, especially one that's premised on surplus and creating surplus for the state, there you're transforming the environment to bring the energy to you, especially then when in the carbon era, because you're kind of producing all the commodities elsewhere. So like in one paradigm, you're moving through the environment to get the stuff, and in the other one, you're transforming the environment and bringing it. So those are two fundamentally different spatial orders. And the irony in many ways of the carbon mobility paradigm is that it's premised on sense, that you would live in one place. So I just think there's so many super interesting contradictions in that sense. So like I'm very skeptical of just this like carbon mobility is all movement, we're all dandelions. I'm not dandelions. We are totally not dandelions.
And also this last question, I have like a clarification question. There's so much I found really powerful and evocative about this talk, but I'm kind of thinking about the first gentleman, he asked this question about electrification.
Yeah.
And what is the argument to somebody who's like, okay, we have all this infrastructure that is based on separation. Instead of like, the costliness of rebuilding all that infrastructure and carrying out what we have, like electrification and wind farms and solar and like massive lithium mining in the lithium triangle. Like we can reuse our infrastructure while maintaining that automobility, even without the carbon. Like what would be a counter argument to that?
Well, I think that whatever the project is for overcoming carbon farm, I think cannot really involve erasure. I think we have to build on top of and kind of overwrite and sort of subvert, and like I think the tactics have to be a little bit different. And I think we have to be very wary of the sense that like carbon farm has to be deleted and start over. That's a modernist mindset, right? That we can't really replicate either. So in my mind, that's part of the carbon legacy. That the carbon legacy is that you have so much energy abundance that whatever you see, you just take it away, erase, and build on top of it. We can't replicate that in and of itself. So I think that the strategies just have to be different. And I wish that I had like 1,000 design projects of my own at this point in my life to show you how I'm working on it. But in many ways, that's the next stage of the research. But the work that we did with the Community Land Trust was actually an example of where we were trying to write we were trying to write new spatial dynamics onto an existing spatial order. Right, where we were saying if we can kind of just subvert this one thing and we can like basically have this land be decommodified, and if we have these people who need to be part of the land trust, then the lot line legally is still in place, but practically is not, like people aren't using it anymore, basically. The fence can come down. And so you write a different spatial relationship on top of you. So I feel like that could be one of many strategies, but I think that it's not well, maybe it's overriding, what's the right term? It's just not like it's not a pretending that there's a tabula rasa and building a whole new infrastructure. It has to be some kind of like subversion, diversion, hacking, overriding, something else.
Rerouting.
Yes, rerouting, yeah.